Well, good morning, and thank you all for coming to the Comptroller's office for our analysis of the New York City's preliminary FY 2015 budget. Joining me here today are some of our Deputy Comptrollers: Tim Mulligan, Deputy Comptroller for Budget; Carol Kostick, Deputy Comptroller for Public Finance. We have Lisa Flores, Deputy Comptroller for Contracts; Camille Joseph, Deputy Comptroller for Public Affairs; Kay Diaz is our General Counsel; Marjorie Landa, Deputy Comptroller for Audits; and Sasha Owen is our Chief of Staff. So we're here at a great moment of transition for our city. There are new agendas being introduced at both the state and city level, and new challenges facing our economy and finances. I want to offer some thoughts on the road ahead, in keeping with the charter-mandated duty of the Comptroller to comment on the financial condition of our city. First, I'm going to talk about our city's economy and some important trends, both locally and nationally, and then we'll spend some time on the city's budget and some critical challenges I see on our horizon. As you can see from the charts, New York City has outperformed the nation on job growth in nearly every industry sector. We've gained back the number of jobs lost in the Great Recession and then some, adding nearly 5% more. Private sector jobs have grown fastest by over 6% from the pre-recession peak, and the city's done this despite a reorganization of the financial sector. For us, in New York City, Wall Street isn't just about lawyers and bankers. It's about secretaries and building workers that keep the street moving, and thousands of back office jobs that support our families, our restaurants, our retail stores, and other businesses through New York City. Thankfully, while Wall Street continues to streamline its operations, we are gaining in professional and business services. If you look at the chart, we're up 4.7%. Our booming tech sector is a big part of that. While the West Coast and Silicon Valley produce the software and operating systems that power our new digital lifestyles, increasingly companies are coming to New York City for the content and advertising they need to take their apps and software to the next level. These ventures are clearly an extension of the media and Madison Avenue businesses that fueled the Mad Men economy of an earlier generation. Leisure and hospitality also continues to drive our economy. You can see we're still up 20.6%. Maintaining New York's status as a safe largest city certainly helps as well. We welcome the world to our shores. Our priorities in terms of safety and making sure people want to come here obviously makes a big difference in our economy. Now, having said all that, there are some real challenges ahead that this chart also shows. Construction jobs are down 12.9%, although it's helpful to remember that this was from the recent peak during the housing bubble, and manufacturing jobs continue their long slide down 19.4%. Most troubling, in the last year or so, many of our new jobs are low wage, which leads us to the unemployment rate. Next slide. The unemployment rate in New York City is declining. It's down to 8.1%, but it has not dropped as fast or as far as the national unemployment rate, which stands at 6.7%. This is something of a puzzle because, after all, New York City's economy is growing jobs faster than the rest of the nation. So the reality is that many people outside of New York City have given up looking for a job, and they are not counted in the unemployment statistics. Whereas in New York City, New Yorkers continue to struggle to look for work. So the good news is the more jobs we create in the city, the better off we'll be, because people do want to get back to work in our city. There are other reasons to temper our optimism about the strength of our economy. Next slide. This graph shows the strength of 3 prior recoveries as compared to the current one. You may see the pattern here. The growth in the GDP has been slower in each successive economy. We used to come sprinting out of the recession at 4.1%, but over time, we're sort of in a slow walk. Our growth is only 2.3%, so there's clearly challenges in terms of coming back or sort of returning to pre-recession peak days. The reality is that while we continue to jog at half pace, we have to think about why that is happening. And part of that is, to me, it's really about wages. If we see on this slide, Working families in the city have seen their incomes grow more slowly than the rest of the nation. Now, this chart, wages were growing as fast as 8% in New York City in 2008, but then the bottom fell out, and wage growth has been less than 2% every year. Now, part of that was the shift away from financial services, but while wages may be flat or down, the price of everything is actually going up. So while our wages go down at 2%, Metro card price up 77%, water and sewage has surged 175%, heating oils up 190%. And you can see that we are clearly, as prices continue to rise, we put working people in sort of a difficult position. Now, that disconnect is one reason why I believe we must fight for the right to raise our minimum wage in New York City. Our cost of living is 60% higher than it is in Albany, 80% higher than it is in Buffalo, and clearly when it comes to the minimum wage, one size does not fit all. Bottom line is that we need better job and wage growth to drive the spending. Households got burned in the Great Recession. Many Americans entered 2008 with big credit card debt and even bigger mortgage payments, only to lose much of their home equity and sometimes their jobs. They have responded in the same way a person responds when they touch a stove and pull back. Instead of spending on consumer goods, they're paid down their debt and they're not going to let their credit cards get ahead of their paychecks. Now, that's a wise move on their part, but it points to much more modest growth going forward for the country. Some companies have also paid down their debt and cleaned up their balance sheets. Normally, extra cash on hand would accelerate the recovery, but this time around, companies are reluctant to invest because people aren't spending. So if new stores won't sell that much, then it makes no sense to build it, and that's problematic for expansive growth. So to sum up, as we look at the national and city economy, we've come through the Great Recession with a lot more in our favor than other places. Job growth is strong. Our tech sector is booming. Tourism remains at an all-time high. So all of these are good indicators going forward. And now, having said all that, let me take you through the city budget and how it relates to our economy. Now, Mayor de Blasio and the administration released the preliminary FY 2015 budget last week, and I believe that he has put together a strong presentation. The preliminary budget is required by law to balance the upcoming fiscal year. Typically, that means the spending plan is focused on closing next year's budget gap with a combination of revenues and cuts. But this year was kind of unusual, and not just because it was the first budget of the new administration. It's because FY15 had no remaining gap after the November plan. Most of the cuts that usually make up the springtime budget dance were restored in advance before Christmas. With no gap to close, the new administration had more opportunity than usual to set aside new revenue. City Hall recognized nearly $1.5 billion in additional tax revenue due largely to the modest recovery we discussed. The mayor banked nearly all of that revenue by adding $300 million, where are we, to the General Reserve. We also socked away $1 billion in the Retiree Health Benefits Trust. I applaud the mayor for making that prudent decision because we're certainly going to need the money going forward. The budget commits $530 million to the expansion of full-day universal pre-K and after-school programs, and the plan assumes that Albany will authorize an increase in personal income taxes on those making over $500,000, providing the stable, reliable funding stream that we need. Now, I support the mayor's call for universal pre-K, and as controller, I appreciate that he's also proposed a way to pay for it. But if Albany fails to deliver the taxing authority, the state will need to find a dedicated source of revenue to pay for this important priority. The February plan also increased agency spending by $303 million in FY14 and FY15, as you see from the chart. The administration restored some prior cuts, or pegs as they're known, and also launched some important new policy initiatives. So we were able to relieve NYCHA of the burden of paying for its own police protection, a cap on rental costs for people living with HIV/AIDS. These expenditures are more than offset by debt service savings of $364 million in FY14 and FY15 due to all of our refinancing, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. I also want to mention some of the out-year projections. If you look at FY 16, 17, and 18 for a minute, you can see that here, the task forecast line, we are looking at out-year budget gaps of $1 billion, $530 million, $370 million. This is actually very thin when you get to $370 million, so you could see a downward budget gap in the out years, which could be very significant. Let me have the next slide. I want to show you the role, and let me just explain. Now, there's been some talk this year about the budget surplus. The surplus isn't really a surplus in the way most people think of it. It's not cash available for other purposes. It's important to understand that our city operates under some of the strictest fiscal controls by law in this country. The rules enacted after the fiscal crisis of the 1970s require the city to not only propose and enact balanced budgets, but also close the fiscal year in balance. By necessity, then, the city always has to have a cushion to help it move forward from year to year. It is never extra money because it's always used to balance next year. So think of it as a minimum balance requirement on your checking account, except the city isn't trying to avoid paying fees, it's trying to avoid the threat of another financial control period. Now, this cushion is known by many names in official budget documents. Some call it the budget stabilization account or prior resources account, but the simplest term is it's called the roll. Now, the blue shows the size of the roll coming into the year. Orange shows the amount that the roll grows in a given year. When the roll is partially depleted or drawn down, that's depicted here by the white hatch boxes. You can see in the year shown, 3/4 of the time, especially here, the roll grew, and only 3 times did the roll get drawn down. So if you don't have that $1.7 billion to spend in the roll moving forward, you don't have a balanced FY15 budget. So if you look at this chart and you see how the roll grows, you see during the golden years of 2007, 2008, it peaked unusually high. But in 2009, we needed to reduce the roll to balance the budget. It picked up a little bit in 10 and 11, but it was drawn down in 2012, added a little bit, and now we're down to this. This $1.7 billion, 7.7, cannot be considered surplus because it's going to be rolled to balance the FY15 budget. I also want to just I want to touch on some of our growing expenditures because I think that's significant. This is the growth in all funds expenditures. The table illustrates areas of the FY15 preliminary budget that are either growing quickly or remaining flat. Some areas have grown more slowly in reality in recent years than the plan has projected, but there are some reasons for that. Take debt service, for example. That's projected to grow by 8%, if you see from the chart. But the actual rate of growth is closer to 5.3%. That's the growth over the last 5 years. So we think that's a generous assumption. As Comptroller, I'm committed to aggressively pursuing refinancing opportunities. Thanks to our Deputy Comptroller for Public Finance, Carol Kostick. We've already worked with OMB to refinance some $24 million in debt, and that's reflected in this plan. I also want to talk about claims and adjustments. Many of you have written about this, the exploding costs. If you look at where we are in FY14 at $663 million, those claims against the city are expected to soar to $782 million, annual growth at 4.2%. We would argue that some of the work we're doing in the Comptroller's office, our new initiative that we're going to roll out called ClaimStat, where we can better track why the city and where the city is getting sued, whether it's NYPD or other agencies, we do believe that we can bring down that annual growth rate, saving the city money. So I think on balance, this gives you an accurate sort of indication of where we're heading, and some of the assumptions we would challenge, but overall, obviously, we think this is a prudent budget plan. I want to talk about the big elephant in the room this morning, and that's that line item called salaries. So if you look at salaries and wages, we assume a 1% annual growth. The Achilles heel of this FY15 preliminary budget is that it does not provide or adequately anticipate the resolution of some 150 outstanding labor contracts. Can we show the next slide? Take a look at this graph. It illustrates the complexity of the expired labor contracts. The circles here represent the size of the contracts laid out on a timeline showing when they expired. The orange circles are those contracts from what is considered the prior round of bargaining, primarily the UFT and CSA. The purple circles show uniform contracts of police, fire, correction, and sanitation workers. And the blue circles show civilian contracts. Now, because there are so many separate contracts and bargaining units, we've only shown the largest and have combined others just to illustrate their relative scale. It's important to note that retroactive pay is an issue for all municipal workers with expired contracts, and it's also interesting to remember that DC 37 has been without a contract nearly as long as the UFT. From a budget perspective, this is important because retroactive salary must be funded in the fiscal year in which the contract is settled. Because of the role we've previously discussed, remember the role? A retroactive obligation in FY14 immediately affects the budget balance of FY15. It's a complex and daunting task to negotiate through this landscape, and we are lucky to have leadership on both sides of the table committed to swift and fair resolution. It is critical that we resolve these contracts, or we're on our way to resolve these contracts by June 30th. Our municipal workers have waited too long for a settlement, and our taxpayers need to know the true state of the city's fiscal situation. Neither is possible without knowing the extent of this liability and how it will be funded. If we do not have a clear resolution of the cost of labor settlement by around June 30th, we run the risk of the decision made for the taxpayers by arbitration panels. I have said repeatedly that the negotiations cannot take place in the media. We can and we must come to an agreement, and we need to get it done by June 30th to maintain the fiscal strength of our city. Now, the good news is there are ways to meet the challenges ahead, and the executive budget in May needs to consider additional savings and resources. I've identified 10. I just want to take you through them quickly. Restore revenue sharing to New York City, better known as AIM. The city lost $327 million in revenue sharing in the past. Over the last 3 years, we're shorted by the state of over $1 billion. We're the only big city that gets no revenue sharing from the state. When you think of the fact that we contribute $5 billion more to the state than we get back, that's pretty outrageous. We should collect education funds due to the city under the Campaign for Fiscal Equity. I point this out because we are owed $2.7 billion. We should get some of that back. We should find a stable and reliable source of funding for full-day universal pre-kindergarten. Obviously, we've talked about that, the mayor's proposal. We are fortunate enough to get the $8 billion federal Medicaid waiver, but New York City must claim its fair share, and that should move very quickly. We have to produce agency savings from efficiencies that don't reduce services or hurt vulnerable populations. We have not had a PEG yet authorized or issued. Clearly, there are efficiencies that we should look at, and we're going to try to help identify some of those. We should achieve savings through productivity and benefit reforms, including healthcare costs. That's something that that's part of, I think, labor agreements. We have to reform tax expenditures. We should take a look at some of the tax abatements we give out to large corporations. We should keep the ones that work. We should reform the ones that don't, because any kind of tax abatement that we give out is less money in the general budget. We should generate additional savings in FY15 debt service through aggressive refinancing. That's half my job, and I want to assure you that we're going to be working with OMB to look at all kinds of refinancing. Interest rates are low. We have to continue to take advantage of that. That's helped us a lot. We should recognize FY14 resources from prior year payables that are not needed, go through the agencies, work with the commissioners, and then we should realize savings from ending the budget dance that the mayor's committed to, and member item reform. These are some of the ideas that we have. Listen, it's my job as the Chief Fiscal Officer of the city to bring these important financial and budgetary issues to the forefront. The truth is, we've always faced budget challenges in New York. We always overcome them by working together, by recognizing our common obligation to the taxpayers of our city. I have full confidence that the administration, taxpayers, and organized labor all want the same thing: to keep New York growing, to ensure that workers are compensated fairly, and to maintain New York's status as the greatest city in the world. I want to thank you all for coming to our budget analysis. This is our discussion on the preliminary budget. It's my intention as Comptroller to use the authority that the charter gives me to come before you and New Yorkers to talk about the budget, both preliminary, executive, and final adoption. So with that said, I'd be happy to take any questions, and I thank you all for coming.